Welcome again, everyone. Um, so this is the second part of a talk that I've labeled the Four Noble Truths of Whiteness. And the second part isn't really dependent on the first part, so you should understand fine if you didn't hear the first part. I'm going to start off this talk with a quote. And I'm interested more in how this quote lands, not so much intellectually, but in our bodies. So this is a quote from James Baldwin. He spoke these words in a talk he gave in 1960. Freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be. Our minds might encourage us to decide whether we agree or disagree with this statement, which is totally fine. But as I repeat this quote, it might be more interesting to attend to this repetition of the word freedom. What does that feel like in the body? Freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be. Tonight, we're going to be spending some time reflecting on this concept, this third noble truth, which is the cessation of suffering, the end of suffering. So often, our Buddhist teachings encourage us to attend to this experience of our present moment. And so often, especially this year, this present moment can feel very unfree. In our practices, I'm sure that many of us have been instructed to work with anxiety, notice loneliness or grief or fear, and to develop a relationship with these emotions. For those of us who did hear the first part of this talk, I spent a good deal of it directing us all to be present with the disconnection, the isolation that our country's racial hierarchy can create and reinforce in white folks like me. But there is more to the Buddha's teachings than simply noticing suffering and attending to its origins. There is this third noble truth, that an end to suffering exists. I think this part of our path together is worth noting, especially now, when fear and hope are in such determined conversation with one another. It serves us all to remember that the Buddha taught liberation. He taught a path that alleviates the suffering of the world. So, as I guided us in the meditation earlier, we might again bring our minds to any kind of difficulty, any kind of sadness that might be present for each of us this evening. Sometimes I like to pretend that whatever is difficult for me is a new object that I'm turning over in my hands. taking notice, acknowledging, ah, this is here. Sometimes we might be able to see or feel a softening in the body as we cultivate compassion for ourselves in the face of so many struggles right now. And as we greet whatever difficulty might be before us again this evening, we might gently take notice. Does this difficulty feel personal? Something in relationship to our individual unit? Or could it be characterized more as collective, a collective difficulty? We'll be spending some more time with this blurry line between the personal and collective this evening. We'll also be spending some time now asking ourselves, what does freedom mean for us in relationship to this difficulty? This third noble truth. What does it mean for the cessation of suffering in relationship to our current challenge? Would freedom mean 5% less pain or reactivity? Is freedom the same thing as healing? Does the end of suffering mean that life is perfect? There's a quote by Nina Simone. I tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. Do we each have our own interpretation of what the end of suffering may be? These may sound like unanswerable questions. Perhaps they are. And yet, it's likely that many, if not most of us, are drawn to this tradition and these teachings because we are drawn to the possibility of freedom, the possibility of moments of ease and stillness in a life that offers very few such moments at times. Reverend Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, a Black queer Zen priest, writes in her book, The Way of Tenderness. Our collective liberation requires that society, which is a collective body, must reconcile the harm within and without. Society must learn to see. A society that does not examine itself is an unenlightened one. So tonight we'll be taking some of her guidance together as a group. First, giving some focus to our immediate society, this group gathered here on Zoom. How is it that a group of mostly white, Western convert Buddhists came to exist in this part of Central Virginia? What are some of the origins of this tradition of spiritual seekers? And how do we as a group relate to the foundation of this country and its institutions? As most of us may already know, we are part of the Insight tradition, which is a subset of Theravadan Vipassana, a branch of Buddhism. Many of us also probably know that this lineage was created in this country in the mid-70s by several white Americans who spent some time in different Asian contexts, studying these teachings. What may be a little less well known is that the roots of some of these teachings that were transferred from Asia to the US evolved from the British colonial rule of Burma, which began in November of 1885. We're pretty fortunate here in Charlottesville. There's a professor of Buddhist studies, Eric Braun, at UVA, who's written extensively on this subject of insight meditation and its origins. And he writes that prior to November of 1885, no trend toward widespread meditation had developed anywhere. In other words, meditation was not a practice that lay people like ourselves anywhere in the world had participated in any concentrated manner throughout human history. Meditating was for monastics. So white-bodied European colonizers overthrew the last king of Burma. And with his exile, the monarchy-based support system for the state's Buddhist monastics and monasteries was thrown into jeopardy as well. Professor Braun writes, though, that Burmese Buddhists of that time did not take this lying down. He writes, with an empowered sense of themselves as a collective whole, born in group study of Buddhist theory, the laity took on the role of protecting the Dharma, previously the duty of the king. So several aspects of this very summarized snippet of Burmese history seem notable to me and also relevant for our context. One is that these practices that we hold dear have arisen amid a background of oppression, upheaval, colonization. Buddhism as a framework for alleviating suffering in the world is capable of changing shape in order to serve as an appropriate response to the suffering that is present in any given context. The second significant note for me is this collective nature of the Burmese response. The innovation and resilience of the Burmese people as a collective whole allowed for this groundswell of support and protection of the Dharma. So how do we link this back to the present day? To our current situation, the Four Noble Truths? I wonder if we can take a few steps back from the minutiae of the events in our country. If we can take a few steps back, we might be able to ask with some genuine curiosity, what is going on here in this nation? In this month, in this year, what are the origins of the suffering that we are facing as a country? I don't mean at the level of the daily news cycle or at the level of one individual actor, but at a much deeper level. What is going on here? Linking us back to the here and now is this idea that we too in this country are the product of a colonial endeavor. The British came to these lands, to this very land actually in Virginia, where many of us sit. And 400 years ago, the Monacan people were living here as a settled agricultural society. Like the Burmese, the Monacan people have been stalwart in their display of innovation and resilience in the face of white-bodied colonizers throughout the last 400 years. Notably, the Monacan Indian nation gained federal recognition on January 30th of 2018. I wonder how many of us know much of anything about the Monacan people. I certainly don't know much. Many of us here tonight are likely already well versed in the role that our state of Virginia also played in establishing the institution of enslavement in this country. Our Virginia House of Burgesses was the colony's first legislative body. And since the mid 1600s, our legislative branch has been codifying the ownership of human beings by other human beings. Now I'm going to pause here because these may seem like simple facts. And sometimes there's a way that simple facts turn very intellectual. We just take them in with our minds. So we might notice if and how our bodies can take in these facts. The history of this land, perhaps the land that we're sitting on right now. And there's a thought that maybe is just a thought. Perhaps this is part of the pathway that the Four Noble Truths point us down. There is suffering, so much suffering in our nation right now. The first noble truth. There is an origin to suffering, the second noble truth. And what if instead of seeing the history we've just briefly touched on here as simple facts, we remember to see them as still alive and still surrounding us? We might think of the very small marker on this town's court square, indicating the space where Black bodies were once bought and sold. We might think of the current campaign going on right now to preserve the integrity of the Monacan nation's historical capital, which is just 30 miles away from here, from Charlottesville. White-bodied folks in this country have found and continue to find ourselves so deeply disconnected from our past, from the land, from our own innate wisdom, that we have traveled halfway across the world to re-enlist the indigenous knowledge of other societies in order to help us reconnect with our own. There have been spaces of oppression, separation, and upheaval, even before Buddhism was an idea that could be referred to. Whether that be in the caste system of the Asian subcontinent in the years that the Buddha lived, during the colonial project of the British in Burma, or the colonial project that led to the genocide of Native Indigenous peoples here in Virginia. In this year of pandemic, we might easily forget that the Native people of this land also experienced an epidemic. This was a new fact to me but it's been estimated that smallpox killed more indigenous people than any kind of weapon. So, returning to this question of freedom, what does the cessation of suffering mean today in this doozy of a year that is 2020? For many white bodied folks, very much like me, who take up this practice of meditation, freedom from suffering often means freedom from our own personal complexes. The beginning of my practice when I was 23 was very much in this vein. I had a body racked with anxiety, a mind constantly vigilant, disconnecting relationships to myself and to others. I came to this practice, as so many of us do, out of profound suffering. But it wasn't until years of practice that my personal suffering and the suffering of our collective world have become synonymous. Our Sangha has been very fortunate to have had the mentorship of Ruth King in our collective work towards racial awakening. Throughout her book and her work with us, Ruth has reminded white folks that we tend to see ourselves as individuals instead of as part of a white racial group. This is not true for all white folks, but it is true for many. This quote is from Lama Rod Owens, who was a Black queer Tibetan teacher. White folks come into Buddhist communities and they don't often know what it means to be part of a collective, part of a community. That's really alarming for someone like me who comes out of a Black congregational upbringing where you're interacting, you're together, you're concerned about the collective, you're concerned about how people are doing. I practice not just for myself, I practice for others around me. Pat did a great job earlier tonight talking some about the Eightfold Path in relationship to our dear John Conover. As some of us might know, the fourth noble truth is this Eightfold Path. A set of 8 practices, aspects of practice that really can guide us to the alleviation of suffering. These 8 lines of inquiry offer such richness for us to contemplate. As many of us here tonight are white-bodied, dominant caste folks, there can often be such difficulty for us in figuring out how to unpack and work with our personal and collective legacy. This Eightfold Path offers some guidance. As Pat said earlier, the path asks, what is wise intention? What are our intentions? And how are they consciously and unconsciously motivating us and our actions in this world? How do we cultivate an intention of compassion for ourselves and for others? What is wise livelihood? How does our livelihood contribute to healing? What is wise speech? How do we show up in this world using our voices, whatever power and advantage we may hold, for the benefit of all beings? These aren't meant to be easy questions that we can answer now or maybe ever. Perhaps they are worthy of a lifetime of contemplation. So I'd like to end our time together with some collective practice. One of the aspects of the Eightfold Path is wise view. And so now we'll be moving into the contemplation of our views of this land on which we've built our lives. So I invite us all to settle in once more to ourselves. And as we will be contemplating our view of this land upon which we sit, we might again bring our attention to the presence of ground underneath us. There could be an awareness that somewhere, perhaps very far below us, there is actual dirt. Hard earth. A ground that is stable, reliable, very solid. This earth is encouraging us to settle, and allow a supporting of our weight. And as we come into greater presence with our bodies, we might bring to mind a particular patch of land that is especially dear to us. This could be as simple as a backyard, a special tree, a trail in the forest, or a river. Some piece of earth with which we have a relationship. In our minds, we might envision this piece of earth in a particular season, a particular kind of weather or time of day. And as our sense of presence with this piece of land might deepen, we could notice, how does this relationship to the land settle in our bodies? How does this body feel being on this land, knowing that it exists, having access to the beauty of this land? And as we broaden our relational field, we might also be able to touch into this question: what is it like for this land to be in relationship with me? Does this land enjoy my presence? Does it merely tolerate me? Does it notice me at all? And from this more broad viewpoint, we might also catch some glimpses of the scope of human history that this land has been witness to. If our patch of land is located in the southern region here of the US, it's quite likely that there has been civil war. This land could have been part of a plantation, could have been the site of terrible brutality against enslaved or indigenous people. And further back, much, much further back, there was a relationship between this land and its native people. Without needing to idealize these people as perfect or flawless, it can still be true that there were other ways of relating with this land, other ways of knowing this land, other ways of listening, other forms of wisdom. We might take some moments to acknowledge the importance of land in our lives. As I read this poem from Karen Wood, a member of the Monacan Indian Nation, this is called The Naming. Some nights we feel the furred darkness of an ancient one's breath and are trapped in awakening. Dismembered by events we no longer recall. We can touch the windowsill where October air gathers as hours slip past in thin robes. The forest a concert of voices. The last crickets let go of their songs. The land speaks, its language arising from its own geography. The mountain's hulked shapes are blue whales, remembering when they were undersea ridges. And rivers are serpentine strands, hammered from silver. And dark trees talk to the wind, weaving mortal lives. Drumbeats, pillars of smoke, voices wavering into updraft. The storyteller shifting the present. So thank you everyone for your attention tonight.